If you enjoy this episode of the Permaculture podcast and would like more from the show, including directly influencing upcoming episodes, receiving announcements for upcoming video live streams, as well as a regular look behind the scenes, become a member of the podcast Patreon community today. For as little as $1 a month, you'll receive patron-exclusive posts and updates not available anywhere else. At just $5 a month, you'll receive those as well as early access to every new episode ad-free. Join now at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. Only 10 weeks remain in the annual Summer to Fall fundraiser, and the show needs your help. Your direct donations during this campaign allow the podcast to thrive rather than subsist. Through this support, you can hear coverage of conferences and events, as well as interviews recorded in person and face-to-face. New for the coming year, this work expands to include video documentaries of permaculture people and projects. None of these can happen, however, without you. Donate now using Venmo at Permaculture Podcast, online at paypal.me/permaculturepodcast, or you can send something in the mail. Scott Mann, 210 East Fairfax Street, number 300, Falls Church, Virginia, 22046. A note on the content for today's episode. The interview which follows is a discussion of disasters and their impacts, including food insecurity, personal injury, and suicide. Listener discretion is advised. This is the Permaculture Podcast. I'm Scott Mann. How do we prepare ourselves for disasters, whether natural or man-made, such as a seasonal storm, global pandemic, economic collapse, or political upheaval? This question and those scenarios forms the basis for co-host David Bilbrey's interview with David Dodd. Mr. Dodd is the founder of International Sustainable Resilience Center, a nonprofit focusing on helping communities recover from disasters and build the capacity necessary to prepare for and withstand these disruptions in the future. Specializing in economic development and drawing from his experiences in Louisiana, Japan, Mexico, and Puerto Rico, David begins by sharing ways to achieve resilience throughout a local region by investing in small business, growing individual entrepreneurship, and creating continuity plans. The conversation then shifts in a more personal direction as he provides an intimate look at several transformative experiences from his own life and his perspective on the 4 steps to take to move our individual lives and communities towards resilience. Throughout, he shares stories and anecdotes that weave all these lessons together. Enjoy this conversation between David Dodd and David Bilbrey, and I'll join you again after.
Hi, this is David Bilbrey with ecothinkit.com and the Permaculture Podcast, and I'm here today with David Dodd. He's the founder and CEO of International Sustainable Resilience Center, or ISRC. Welcome, David. Thanks for taking some time to talk today.
It's great to be here, David. Thank you for having me.
You know, looking at the work you're doing, it's really interesting and important in the times we're living in. This idea of, COVID happening and the natural disasters layering on top of that, and how do we handle it? One, whether we're prepared or not, because you have to, and then how can we prepare for that more in the future? So very interesting, really important subject matter. But for starters, I'm really curious about how you found your way to this work.
It's one word, Katrina. So I'm a native Louisianian. I live in New Orleans, and I was actually working in Mexico. My background is economic development, and I was bringing economic development professional education into Mexico. And I'll never forget this, David. The hotel I was staying in had a satellite monitor, kind of a novelty, in the lobby. Came in the evening of August 28th, 2005, and I looked down into that monitor, and there was this huge monster covering almost the entire Gulf of Mexico. And I said, oh my God. And I cued into the US News and learned what was happening. And so I was very good friends with the head of economic development in Louisiana. And I sent him a message and I said, what can I do to help? 2 days later, on the 30th, he sent me excuse the French, but I'm just quoting him, a 5-word response. And that was, get your ass to Baton Rouge, because Baton Rouge is the capital of Louisiana. And so I did. And that started a complete shift in my career. So because of the profile of Katrina, And I put together a big summit in Washington with Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, the 4 affected states, and got a lot of recognition for that, and then started getting requests for similar help to come help try to put the economies back together. So my specialty has always been economic resilience. And flash forward to Japan in 2011, I was helping them develop their economic recovery framework after the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami. And I met a gentleman from the UN, and the next thing I know, I'm setting up a center of excellence specializing in public-private partnerships for disaster resilience and recovery and for sustainability. So the name of my center says that, the International Sustainable Resilience Center. What it doesn't say is that we specialize in public-private partnerships, because the name's long enough as it is. And so we established that, got it off the ground in 2017, and now we're fully functioning. And in addition to that, I also do work for the federal government in disaster recovery and economic recovery from disaster. And that's what I'm doing now in Puerto Rico. And we hopefully can get into that a little bit in a few minutes.
Let's talk a little bit about the kind of massive problems you're addressing, maybe tee this up a little bit. And then before we get depressed, we'll talk about the solutions that you're applying, and then maybe even some ideas about what we can do as just citizens to also take part in this work.
Sure. Well, let's start with the facts. And the facts are, I wrote an article for Yahoo Finance. They asked me to write a guest article. And the title of the article was, Natural Disasters Could Care Less About COVID-19. Because in the terrible tragedy of COVID, which understandably and justifiably got all of our attention, in the middle of that, disasters continued at a record pace. In fact, the record of 2017, which stood for 3 years, was broken in 2020 as far as numbers and intensity of natural disasters. And the strongest tropical storm, we call them hurricanes, they call them typhoons in other parts of the world, hit the coast of the Philippines, and it was by far the strongest wind speed that had ever hit anywhere in the world. And then meanwhile, here in the U.S., of course, we know about Lake Charles, and the first hurricane that hit Lake Charles was tied for the strongest hurricane ever recorded. So this is going to continue to happen, David, and it's going to continue to happen in terms of numbers and in terms of intensity. We're having weather events where there never were weather events, tornadoes in the UK and in France, and these things are going to continue. So we have to continue the fight against COVID, and we have to continue to try to recover and become more resilient to COVID. But in the meantime, we have to continue to become more resilient to natural disasters.
And define resilient a little bit for us in your perspective.
I'll define it first, and I'll tell you a quick story that connects to permaculture, which is a direct connection. So resilience is defined as the ability to better withstand and more quickly recover from disruptive incidents. A disruptive incident could be a natural disaster. It could be a man-made disaster, such as the Gulf oil spill. It could be a pandemic, of course, we know that. It could be a terrorist attack. Think about 9/11. It could be economic collapse. Think about the Great Recession. It could be political upheaval. Look at what's happening right now between Palestine and Israel.
Mm-hmm.
They're all forms of adverse incidents. And so how do you more adequately equip yourself to deal with those? You become more resilient. And becoming more resilient necessarily means becoming more sustainable and learning how to do more with less, learning how to view the community you're in, the systems in which you operate in a holistic manner as an ecosystem. And what is permaculture based on? It's based on those same principles. So there's an absolute direct connection between those two. Now, if you'll indulge me for 2 more minutes, I'll tell a quick story about
Yeah.
my introduction to permaculture. So I was raised in North Louisiana, a place called Shreveport that no one's ever heard of, but it's 3 hours east of Dallas. Well, just outside of Shreveport, we had the distinction of having one of the largest Army ammunition manufacturing facilities in the U.S. and had been in operation since World War II. And they decommissioned that base in the early 90s. And lo and behold, a group of people came into Shreveport, and one of them was Australian, and he was a student of Bill Mollison. And they said, we want to establish a national center for permaculture at the Army ammunition plant. And we all said, what? Because there were still tons of weapons out there and no telling what was in the ground. But their idea was they were going to bring in their own dirt, they were going to bring in their own materials, and they were going to do experiments, and they were going to see, how you can deal with things like, environmental catastrophes, which it was. It was a Superfund site. And the Army took one look at them and said, thanks, but no thanks. But along the way, they were there for 3 or 4 months. I really became enamored with the whole permaculture movement. And it really was kind of a turning point for me, David, in my understanding of the connection between people, the environment, the places that they live. That was really an eye-opening experience, because I was in my early 30s and, grew up pretty traditional, thinking about the traditional economy. My dad actually had a factory farm. We had a manufacturing plant that manufactured a living thing. It was a hatchery. And we hatched 1 million baby chicks a month at one point. And how in the world can that be a sustainable practice? It's not. And so learning about a different way was a really great experience for me and led me, I think, down the path. As I told you earlier, I have become a big fan of the circular economy movement, which to me, there would be no circular economy movement if it weren't for permaculture.
So we've got huge issues. And so let's talk about solutions as you guys are applying them at ISRC. And if you want to just take an example and walk us through a particular project, that might be one way to do it. So I'll leave it up to you.
In full disclosure, ISRC is a nonprofit. We do a variety of things, including education on resilience. Again, we specialize in public-private partnerships that increase resilience and in integrating resilience into public-private partnerships of all types. And one of the things that we hope to do, and we have some contacts, is to ensure that this big infrastructure plan that is coming down the pike and in some form or fashion certainly will be passed, that we ensure that both sustainability and resilience are integrated into those projects, and that whenever possible, they promote environmental stewardship rather than detract from it. And one of the things that I've done, again, in disclosure for 9 years now, is I've done disaster recovery work for the federal government as a contractor. And in late 2017, a group of us reported to Puerto Rico to try to help recover from Hurricanes Irma and Maria, which, if there's any comparison to Katrina in the U.S., it's Irma and Maria. Maria just completely tore through Puerto Rico, and their infrastructure was shaky already because of economic hardships they'd had for years. So I didn't come until mid-2018, but we were trying to address not only the recovery, but address resilience through transformative and more sustainable economy. And a part of that, the field coordinator, who is the leader of the economic recovery team, visionary guy, started looking at how we could develop sustainably in a way, a very similar way to permaculture, but looking at the blue infrastructure, the coral reefs, the seagrass, seaweed, beaches, sand dunes, mangrove orchards, and how that could be valued and the value of that be put into making certain that those natural infrastructure assets were all connected, that they fed off of each other, that they were sustainable. And when you include the fisheries, that the fisheries operated in a sustainable manner, operated in a manner that had the least impact on the environment. And that idea, that concept has moved toward reality in a big way. And we are having a summit that's free to attend, and it will be a virtual summit on that, in which we're going to bring in expertise talking about sustainable development, talking about how natural assets can be valued and protected. And so it's really exciting to see this really in practice. And, in my mind, this is a form of permaculture because we're applying many of the same principles.
So what kind of solutions are you applying when a natural disaster occurs? So what's the most recent one you guys have worked on?
Well, the most recent is still Puerto Rico. That's a major part of our plan, but we also are trying to build capacity. One of the things that happens in an economy that's ravaged by a natural disaster is you have a loss of capacity. When I say capacity, David, that really means, ability to obtain the resources needed to move an economy forward. And we have focused a lot on that and building organizational capacity, actually creating a new regional organization that is going to cover the region where we're going to do the natural asset initiative. So they'll be a part of that. And, we really try hard to take a holistic approach to economic recovery and resilience, because one of the stories I often tell, David, is when I was in Japan, we took a tour of 4 cities on the East Coast that were devastated, completely devastated by the tsunami that hit after the earthquake that damaged the Fukushima plant. This was all north of Fukushima. We weren't in any radioactive danger, but we certainly saw absolute destruction. And there was a port city called Ofantu, and they had a big Nissan steel plant there, and they made fenders for the Honda Accord. And the plant had a very thorough continuation plan. They call business resilience plans, they call them continuity plans because it's continuity of operations, but really they're resilience plans. Anyway, they were able to be up again in 48 hours. The problem, David, was they couldn't operate because no one could get there because the citizens were dispersed, their homes were destroyed. So you can't look at economic resilience in a vacuum. You have to look at whole community resilience before you can have economic resilience.
Right. I remember a story that Toby Hemingway was telling years ago, and he was talking about when he first got into permaculture and bought a property and built this beautiful food forest. And he was standing out at the gate by the road one day, and he's like, if stuff goes wrong in the world, unless I'm willing to stand out here with a gun and protect all this, I'm going to be in trouble. So I need to start sharing the word and getting other people resilient as well, because you're not an island, you're on a planet hurling through space, and we're all in this together. So
real quick, a butterfly flutters its wings in the Atlantic, and by the time it gets to the other side of the Pacific, it's a hurricane. That's the old thing about impacts. Again, this has to do with both the flaws in our current economic system and what permaculture takes into account that the traditional, economy doesn't. And that's the linkage between organisms in an ecosystem. So they couldn't make the fenders for the Accord, so they couldn't assemble Accords in Tokyo. So guess what? American dealerships were running out of Accords. That's the impact. And understanding that impact, whether it's positive or negative, is a key principle of resilience.
Right. And I don't think a lot of us in the West and in America are really aware of those dynamics and how many things we're dependent on. I live in a little mountain town. There's a lot of mountain biking here, and there's been huge disruptions in the supply chain for bicycles. So they can't get enough bicycles. There's long wait periods, all these things. No one ever thought of that about that daily life, right? There's all of these systems that we're heavily dependent on. And because they haven't broken down, we feel like they won't break down, right? But we've had several things happen recently that show us that's not true, not least of which would be Texas's electrical grid, right? In Canada, if that happened, there wouldn't have been a disruption. They have systems in place for their grid to function, even if it's 50 below zero, not in Texas, right? So understanding the systems, what the weaknesses are, and then what we need to do to strengthen them in these scenarios is hugely important. And probably the bigger issue there is just how do you get a system that's so dysfunctional and a government that's so dysfunctional and so short-sighted to even consider it and put money towards those kind of things, right? Because there's not
I could not agree more.
There's not an immediate payoff. You're not necessarily going to get elected the next time around because you did this, but it's going to be actually taking care of the citizens. So that's a big piece. Well, let's talk about Puerto Rico a little bit. What were you guys doing in Puerto Rico?
The Blue Infrastructure Initiative is really front and center right now, but we've also done a lot of work in trying to build or rebuild the entrepreneurial ecosystem there. Often, when you talk about economic development, people, their eyes kind of fog over and they think, oh, you're out chasing General Motors. And there are a good number of economic development organizations that do that. But there are more and more economic development organizations are undertaking sustainability, resilience, equity, inclusion, treating everyone fairly. These are all things that economic development organizations are having to face. It's not that they just woke up and said, oh, I'm enlightened and I'm going to go do these things. They're having to do these things because they're having an impact, a huge impact on a community's ability to help entrepreneurs, to help small businesses. And again, I'm not necessarily a fan of recruiting firms from one place to the other, but if a firm is growing and it needs a new location, it has an impact on that as well. So all of this awareness is coming out of this pandemic and the social unrest we've had this year. And certainly we would wish never that this pandemic occurred or that the loss of life occurred. But if there is a way to look at it in a way that is the silver lining, so to speak, of the cloud, is it's greatly increased the awareness of our environment, of climate and the role of climate, and really has awoken a lot of people who were asleep when it came to those critical issues. And so resilience has certainly become a top of mind and top of discussion issue in all circles. But, when you look at, how you really help transform an economy from being very fragile to robust and resilient, you start with things like that, like the entrepreneurial ecosystem, like, moving away from a tax incentive-based large corporate economy to one that's more reliant on local assets and local skills and things like, I did a lot of work in Arizona, so I'm very familiar with Tucson and Brad Lancaster and his movement with stormwater. And it was amazing, and he and his partner, they buy this dilapidated house and then they sneak out literally at night and do these curb cuts to divert the stormwater. And so the city gets wind of this, and instead of arresting, they hire him to help them to, develop an entire system.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's incredible. So they capture that water and they store it and they're able to use it. And it's simple things like that people don't often recognize or realize that there are things that aren't rocket science. They're not complicated. And in New Orleans, catch basins have become the new cool thing. It's like having a Mardi Gras flag out in front of your house if you have a catch basin now. It has made a difference in helping us deal with water. And I'm a big fan of collaboration, especially from seemingly disparate parties. So I am affiliated also, besides the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, I'm also affiliated with the Water Institute of the Gulf that was established as a result of the BP oil spill and the degradation of the coast of Louisiana. Louisiana, David, loses the equivalent of 3 football fields of marshland every 90 minutes. That's how rapidly the coast is deteriorating. And the
Wow.
more it goes, the worse it gets.
And that's because of decades of sort of misuse, or what's going on there exactly?
It's a combination, certainly misuse. And, when they started drilling in the marshes of Louisiana, they cut canals, which allowed saltwater encroachment, which then killed the native vegetation, which led to the loss of coastline. And so it goes on. And then, of course, there's sea level rise. And it's a very complicated story. I could do an entire show with you on what happened to Louisiana after the flood of 1928, when they dredged the Mississippi and they built all the levees. And, all of that had an impact, a huge impact, and not a positive impact, although it allowed for the city of New Orleans to grow to what it is now, and allowed the U.S. to use the Mississippi River as a major way to feed the rest of the world. It still caused a lot of unforeseen circumstances. So the Water Institute pulled together, and they call it 10X because it's all along Interstate 10 from Florida to California. In all of these states, the resilience officers in all of these states and cities along Interstate 10 come together to talk about places that have too much water and places that don't have enough water. And you go, okay, what's the connection there? Well, they both have issues with water. And how can they work together to try to address those issues? It's really interesting for someone from Phoenix to talk to someone from New Orleans, because, they have quite different circumstances, but they find that they have similar needs in the way of ensuring that there's enough for Arizona and that there's not too much in Louisiana. So those are really interesting things. But back to Puerto Rico, I think that, the biggest impact I think that we're going to have is in the area of increasing the capacity, the understanding of what economic growth really is now and what it really should be. And sustainability is at the top of mind, and so is resilience.
So you're getting an understanding of what's going on, and then are there actions you're taking to help build those economies and that resilience?
Yes. And, this is where the federal government can really be a positive factor, because through grants, we've been able to put the foundation in place for this transformation, and several tens of millions of dollars in grants, doing things like establishing a nonprofit that's dedicated to the blue economy, and establishing a separate but related research center that's going to be researching ways to more sustainable ways and more environmentally friendly ways to utilize this ocean economy. And then on the entrepreneurship side, establishing entrepreneurship centers and accelerators and incubators that help businesses get off the ground, establishing programs to help small businesses, to help them navigate finding resources, getting financing that they need to grow, and providing people with opportunities that they may not have had. So all of those are interconnected.
The work of ISRC, it's related to disaster recovery, but it's not necessarily first responder emergency management. It's more long-term, putting these pieces back together that create a resilient and sustainable community.
I thank you for bringing that up, because that's often neglected. You're correct. We focus on recovery and long-term recovery and resilience, but we couldn't function without the work of the first responders and the emergency management officials, the people that actually stabilize what is often a very unstable situation. We consider them partners, very, very important partners to us. You know, they're the people that run into the building when everyone else is running out. They're the people that put themselves in harm's way to save lives and property.
They're triage in the emergency room, and you are the doctor that's creating an exercise and diet and health plan moving forward, sort of, right?
That's a great analogy. I'm going to have to pay you a bonus now every time I say that.
Right.
But no, that's exactly right. They're the guys that are determining what can be saved, what can't be saved, who's going to be okay without a lot of help. And in the middle is the really critical thing is who will survive, but who cannot survive without assistance. And so that's the basic triage concept. It's been practiced. That was actually developed after 9/11 by the leading person here. He was in New York at the time, and he moved here after Katrina, Michael Hecht, and he developed that system. And it's really critical. There are some businesses that are going to be okay. There are some businesses that, you know, were barely hanging on before that aren't going to make it. And we hate that. The number that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, throws out is 40% of businesses in a major disaster won't ever reopen. And of the ones that reopen, another 30% of those won't make it 5 years. So the numbers are pretty horrific. And anything we can do to lower that by, again, before the disaster, making sure that they have a plan in place, making sure that they have adequate insurance, making sure that they take the steps that are necessary, not only for themselves, but again, for their employees to be better prepared. There's not a person in the world. I'm making a bold statement here, David, on your show. There's not a person in the world that does not need a preparedness plan, does not need a store of food and water, does not need backup and redundant sources of power and communication. Nowhere on earth should someone not have that. And your show is about, you know, something that I have a lot of affection for, the whole idea of permaculture and the circular economy. That's a part of it. Being ready and being able to be self-sustainable to the greatest extent possible. I mean, I said, you know, my dad owned a factory farm. I mean, we saw it. Imagine not being able to have a source of food if all the transportation of food, the supply chain is cut off. Imagine not being able to go somewhere close by and be able to get fresh vegetables or produce or whatever. There are millions, hundreds of millions of people that are in that situation right now around the world.
My grandparents who lived through the Depression, that generation, they all had a garden. They all canned vegetables and fruit. Like they had a plan just because they didn't want to like starve to death if a depression ever happened again. But that equally applies to any number of things that could happen in our current world. And I'm sort of allergic to certain elements of sort of the prepping community and whatever into the world kind of philosophies, but you don't have to have that kind of perspective to realize that there's some really fragile systems just in America alone, where you definitely could go without power and food for a week or two and not even be a major natural disaster. You're
exactly right. And that's a very important point to make. Preppers they're getting ready for the end of the world. That's why they call them preppers. They're preparing for the end of the world. You don't have to be prepared for the end of the world. What you should be prepared for is, again, 3 or 4 days without power, without food, without water. You don't have to have a store of nuclear grade weapons to be prepared, or a place 30 feet underground. You don't have to have that. We're going through this right now, and one of the things that I always make sure people understand, I use a very broad term for resilience, and I cited some things at the beginning of the show, but cyber attacks are a form of man-made disaster. And we're going through that now, right? With this pipeline, which ironically, I think could spur some more thought about this dependence we have on this stuff we pull out of the ground and reducing that dependence. But anyway, this is going to be a factor. So let's say there's an attack on the grid and we all lose power for not a couple of days, but a couple of weeks. How do you stay in touch? How do you continue to do whatever it is that you do? And, those things they're worth thinking about, because the chances of those things happening, they have increased steadily over the past 30 years. They're going to continue to increase. Just be prepared. It's the old Boy Scout motto. I guess now
Right.
Scouts, right? The Scout motto, be prepared.
Be prepared. Well, yeah, and just just to reference for people listening, so there was this attack recently on this oil pipeline that's never been shut down before that supplies oil to the entire eastern side of the country, apparently. And so while, we need to get away from petroleum, this is just an example of cyber attacks can take down systems of many different kinds. And really, obviously, it's a question of when, not if, those kind of things are happening, because they already are, and they understand very little about what just happened until weeks or months later, right? There was one on the, in the U.S. government, right? Even Pentagon and different places last year, whenever that was. And a lot of information was compromised that we still don't even probably fully understand that could affect us in the coming years as well, right? So that brings up, two things. One is, let's talk a little bit about the connection between personal resilience and community resilience as it relates to food and energy, but also on sort of an emotional and thought and sort of spiritual level. Like, how do we have personal resilience so we don't just go into complete panic mode when something happens, right? Because there's a huge difference in an outcome of someone who can remain calm and keep moving forward and taking the appropriate action for the situation versus someone that just freaks out. So let's talk about that on both of those.
I will, with your permission, I'll dive deep.
All right.
I've had to practice personal resilience. Two major life-changing events in my life. In 1994, I had a horrific automobile accident. I broke 16 bones. I lost 6 pints of blood. I flatlined in the ambulance. They said I wouldn't live, and then they said I wouldn't walk again. And I came out of that, walking out of the hospital 3 months after the accident. They said I'd never do that. That's not a testament to me. It's a testament to what I learned. And I always say there are 4 things that are absolutely necessary for resilience, whether it's personal resilience, whether it's community resilience, state resilience, national resilience. The first is you have to gain knowledge. And I was very lucky, David, because I gained knowledge from my parents. Now, my parents were 44 when I was born, and I'm 60. And their lives, living through the Great Depression, living through World War II. My dad had an unfortunate occurrence happen with a business partner and led him to lose everything when he was 43 and start all over the year I was born. So that was a very fortunate thing for me because I didn't have to be educated. I was shown by example. If you don't go through that, and if your parents or grandparents haven't been through that, then you need to learn. You need to expose yourself to knowledge about resilience. And there are a myriad of ways to do that. There are online courses. You can just Google it. In fact, FEMA itself has a great series of courses on resilience and how to be more resilient. The second thing is, out of that knowledge, you have to develop a set of principles. It doesn't have to be anything even written down, but it has to be things that you have in your mind, that I'm going to be prepared. I'm going to work in my community to help it be more prepared. I'm going to do things that will increase the sustainability and therefore increase the resilience of my neighborhood. And then the thing that comes after principles is action. Because you can have all the principles you want, but if you don't act, if you don't what you're thinking you're going to do, you need to do, then you've wasted your time and energy. So taking action, going out and getting those supplies, Going out and helping clean the gutters in your neighborhood because they've gotten full of brush, helping clean that out, under supervised volunteerism, things like that. And then, the last thing is the results. You can go out and be active all day long, but if you don't produce a result, if you don't do something that makes a change of some kind, and we all want it to be a positive change, in your community's ability to withstand adverse incidents, in your own ability to withstand adverse incidents. Almost 2 years ago, I contracted through a cut in my foot a very rare, very aggressive and deadly flesh-eating bacteria. And 36 hours later, I was having my left leg removed to save my life. And the lessons that came from my own parents, the knowledge that I had gained about personal resilience, about the ability to withstand and the ability to come back from whatever happens to you. And now I have a beautiful $60,000 artificial leg with a microprocessor in the knee. And I'm not running the marathon yet, but I'll
So you're not the $1 million man because the technology's gotten cheaper, but you're the $60,000 man.
Yeah.
The bionic man. Right.
Yeah, exactly. The bionic man. So it's a combination, and you don't have to go. The good news is you don't have to almost die twice to become resilient.
Well, that's good.
It absolutely can be learned. You don't have to learn it by example. You can learn it by, again, exposing yourself to knowledge and educating yourself on how to be more resilient. And again, the tie with what your show's about is obvious. You cannot be sustainable if you're not resilient.
So how does one gain that resilience, especially in the context of what you just described of going through a major personal, health issue, but just like back to the personal sort of emotional and intellectual resilience. How does someone prepare that didn't have the upbringing you did to be able to weather these storms?
That's an extremely important area that is far too little is discussed about that, about your emotional, your mental and your spiritual resilience. Because if you're not aware and you're not in tune with yourself, you're not resilient. You are, in fact, very susceptible. And we know what happened during COVID, David. We know about the suicide rate during COVID. We know about suicide rates after natural disasters. They often increase dramatically. And the ability to withstand that and to be able to endure something like a disaster that destroys your home or your business, or worse yet, someone in your family perishes because of disaster, being able to absorb that and deal with that, to me, it's the same principle. It takes knowledge, it takes studying awareness, studying spirituality, understanding what the human soul and mind and heart are capable of withstanding, and preparing yourself. And if you're a person of faith, then you rely on that faith. If you're more of a spiritual person, you rely on that spirituality and that awareness. And there's a lot of help available for that too. I had a conversation today with a friend that I've worked with for 9 years who, said, I wish that my fondest wish is that the stigma attached to seeking mental health is eliminated, is obliterated from the face of the earth. And I couldn't agree more. And know the signs, know when you need help. I sought help. I had not been back from my recovery but 3 months when COVID hit. And it was a blow to be alone, completely alone. And I'm a people person. I travel for a living. I love people.
Right.
And I sought help. And it was the best thing I ever did. And, there are many people now that are quietly suffering, David. And that is as important as having water and food, if not more important. Again, it's not a wishy-washy thing. It's a practical thing. seek spiritual guidance and help, seek mental guidance and help, seek physical help, make sure you're physically in good shape. You take care of yourself so that when these shocks do come, and they will, disasters are going to happen of all kinds, so that you'll be ready. That's the real message.
What about community resilience? How can we take action to build that community resilience where we live?
It's about one primary factor that overrides everything else, and that's connecting with your neighbors, connecting with the folks down the street, connecting with and developing caring relationships with people that you may have been in a neighborhood for 20 years and never met. Reach out to them, because when this happens, people have to rely on each other. And if they're not connected, if there's not, you don't have to be best friends, but if there's not knowledge of who's in the neighborhood, of who might need extra help in case of an emergency, and if they don't know you and don't know the areas in which you need help, you can't be resilient. You can't be a resilient community. You can't be a resilient neighborhood if there's not connectivity between you. If you're not connected, you have to be connected.
That's a really good point. And that kind of gets back to communication, right? So in a situation where normal communication breaks down, if you've communicated over the preceding months and years to know who those people are and who's got resources to share, what those resources are, who's got needs or will have intense needs if things change or the power goes out or whatever, then you're just developing communication. It's just developing it years ahead gives you ability to have knowledge on the ground that's impossible to gain once the event hits, right? So it's opening up that channel of communication so that you have that to work with, right? And which is going to greatly expedite how quickly you can respond and help the other people in the community. So I like that. That's really good.
That's it. That's the key. I mean, there are a lot of things that you can do as a community, but unless you're connected, you're not going to be able to do those things.
So having a near-death experience, this is always interesting to me. So talk a little bit about what that did to you and how it changed the way you look at your life.
Oh, it completely changed me in both instances. The first instance, the accident, I was young and, pretty brash but I was not sure exactly where I was going. I knew that I had found a calling in economic development. I always did small business development, minority and women-owned business development. I helped small businesses with contracting issues, things like that. And I really got a lot of satisfaction out of that, but I wasn't really sure where that was leading. And I had just started teaching at your alma mater, the University of Oklahoma, at the Economic Development Institute, which is a continuing education and professional development national program. And after that accident, I knew that I wanted to become deeply involved with educating people, and especially, again, educating people on what I consider is the best way to do economic development. And that's to start at home, start with your small businesses, your existing companies, your entrepreneurs, and became dean of that institute, and then took that institute to Mexico, the first time it had ever been taught outside the United States, to a place that really was hungering for learning how to build capacity in economic development. So I finished that chapter, got into resilience again while I was in Mexico. I got into resilience through Katrina, and then ended up doing all these resilience and recovery projects, and founded the center. But again, I felt like I was somewhat, I wasn't focused the way I should be focused. And I was planning a big event in October. This occurred to me September of 2019. And after that happened, the very first thing I said, David, when I came out of the fog of surgery and painkillers, I said to myself, I'm doubling down. I was not only left here once, I was left here twice. And the doctors told my daughters, the incident with my amputation, I had a lot of problems because of scar tissue that had formed in my windpipe as a result of the first accident. They couldn't do surgery because they were afraid I wouldn't make it because I was having such trouble breathing and my lungs were filling up with fluid. They had to resuscitate me 4 times. And the doctors told my daughters, if he's going to live, it's up to him. And they basically said, well, then he'll live because there's no one that has more will to live than our dad. And coming out of that and that awareness, I said, okay, someone's sending me a signal here, and it's a pretty strong signal. I've got to double down. So we doubled the size of the event. We doubled the participation in the event. It was a global event that was held here in New Orleans. And my surgery was in September, and we had this planned it all, got it all ready, and conducted it the first week of March. And then COVID hit. So for me, you don't have to go through all that to realize why you're here. And we're all here for a reason. Every one of us is here for a reason. Now, we don't have to save the world. Maybe the reason we're here is to, be the best janitor and do the best at whatever you do. You don't have to save the world to have a purpose and to be of value to this world. We all have within us some desire to achieve and follow that desire and follow wherever it leads. If you would have told me growing up the son of a chicken farmer in Logansport, Louisiana, a town of 1,800 people, that 48 years later, when I was 18, or 38 years later, I would be, doing what I'm doing now and where I'm doing it, I would have said, what are you smoking? Because I want some of it. It's destiny, but it's destiny that you can have an influence on. You can have an influence on, create your own destiny. And if you believe in something, you have passion for something, again, it doesn't have to be, it could be being passionate, for keeping a school clean and sanitary to, help the kids have a better learning environment. I mean, that's pretty important, especially now. It's really important. So find what it is that gives you joy and makes you feel fulfilled. And you can say, oh, well, this all just happened to you. Well, it happened, but it didn't happen with me just sitting on the bench like Forrest Gump. You can have an influence on what happens. You can influence your own future. And yeah, there are things that are going to happen that are completely out of your control. I know that. I had 2 things happen that were completely out of my control. But I didn't let that stop me. And you shouldn't let things that happen to you stop you either. We all have hardships. Don't embrace the hardship. Reject the hardship. Embrace the hope that comes often out of that hardship. And you'll have a more fulfilled life. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your time. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate your thoughts and sharing some of these rather intense things you've been through. Where can people find out more information about you and your work?
My work, and you'll find more about me through that. Just go to the website. It's www.isrc-ppp, 3 P's, public-private partnership. So it's .org. It's a nonprofit, org. So www.isrc-ppp.org. Would love to have everyone come take a look at what we're doing. We're doing some pretty exciting things.
Very good. Well, thanks. Thank you very much. And best of luck in everything that you're doing.
Well, thank you, David. It's been a real joy to be on your show, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
And that was David Dodd. Find his work with the International Sustainable Resilience Center at isrc-ppp.org. The link for that is in the resources section of the show notes, along with another to the great book by Kate Raworth, Donut Economics. I highly recommend this title for anyone interested in alternatives to the dominant economic model, and it's available from Chelsea Green Publishing. I've also included a section in those notes for previous episodes of the Permaculture podcast related to today's topic. Those include Bill Summers on finance and economic development, mutual aid with Zev Friedman, and the several individual conversations on fire and disaster preparedness with Matt Fidler, Oliver Gaucher, and Chris Gilmore. When I first sat down to edit this episode, I wasn't sure where this conversation, with the heavy initial focus on economic development, would fit into the catalog of the Permaculture podcast. Though I take a broad view on what it means to practice these ethics and principles in our individual lives and society, and focus less on the landscape during interviews in order to expand the community discussion of what permaculture can look like beyond that space, there was quite a bit of this interview which initially sounded like it was steeped in the world of business as usual. As I listened to David talk about the kind of work he's engaged in, however, the way these systems move resources and knowledge from government to small business, from the national to the regional and local level, began to make sense and made me think of Chapter 14 of Bill Mollison's Designer's Manual. That chapter highlights many different ways to look at permaculture outside the garden or homestead, and remains a reminder from one of permaculture's co-founders of all the pieces of our society that need the application of our beloved design. So far, however, we've only begun to scratch the surface. Knowing what David and the International Sustainable Resilience Center and other related organizations are doing provides us an opportunity to engage with these allies and ensure people, communities, and Earth are considered and planned for in all of their actions. If you know of or work with communities, companies, or nonprofits that apply permaculture to their practices of inculcating resiliency, I'd like to learn more about them. Leave a comment in the show notes for this episode or get in touch. Call or text 717-827-6266. Send me an email, show@thepermaculturepodcast.com. Or if you prefer to affix a postage stamp to an envelope and write a letter, my address is Scott Mann, 210 East Fairfax Street, number 300, Falls Church, Virginia, 22046. Until the next time, explore what you find most sustaining to your well-being and participate in the activities that build your personal and community resilience while taking care of Earth, yourself, and each other.